This video is brought to you by PrizePicks. So over the weekend, Deion Sanders did an interview with G. Bush. And in that interview, Deion had said something along the lines of he wants to meet with Todd Monken. And this became a bit of a story, especially locally. And I saw this story pop up. And I'm going to be honest here. I really don't think and don't care about this story from the angle of football operations, right? Like if we're looking at this from a pure football ops point of view, this story is pretty irrelevant to that. It's obvious to me that this story is irrelevant to it. I've seen people try to draw connections to what Deion says here and if that matters to the quarterback competition, but I think it's ultimately ridiculous to point to this interview with Deion Sanders and try to draw any kind of parallel to what decision Todd Monken is going to make. It's basically, I feel like people are using the football conversation that surrounds Shedeur as a conduit for a larger conversation. And that larger conversation is, how does the Sanders family make you feel? In a positive direction, in a negative direction? That's what people actually want to talk about whenever I see this story pop up, right? When I've seen radio hosts react to this story, they're not talking about what's relevant to the football. They're talking about how the Sanders family makes them feel, right? Whether they love the Sanders family, indifferent towards the Sanders family, or hate the Sanders family. It usually ends up becoming a debate or an attempted referendum on how the Sanders family makes you feel and how you feel like the Sanders family should make people feel, right? And that's kind of the through line through a lot of conversations that involve Shedeur and therefore can somehow be connected to Deion, is that debate, right? But from a football standpoint, on some level, right? And I'm not saying the people engaging with this are dumb, but we do know that like trying to point this back to football ops is dumb, right? The players, like a player's dad, especially one who is a head coach at a Power 4 team institution, that the Colorado Buffalo, are they not the Colorado Buffaloes? I think they are, or the Buffs. Yeah, the Colorado. Anyways, he coaches the Colorado Buffs. He is a head coach in college football. It makes a lot of sense for him to want an introduction with Todd Monken, right? Like what Deion said makes sense. What Deion said is not abnormal. There will be 50, well, not 50, but there will be 75 guys on the roster, probably about 15 rookies on that roster during camp. And I would imagine of those 15 rookies, 7 or 8 of them are going to have parents who get an introduction with Todd Monken, right? It might not be as thorough as an introduction as Deion Sanders will be able to get with Todd, given that Deion is somebody of interest to Todd Monken, right? Like even if there's not insight that he's trying to gain from Deion as the coach of one of the quarterbacks on his team in college, there's also intrigue for Todd because he's Deion Sanders, right? Like, obviously, Deion wants an introduction with Todd Monken. And I would imagine that feeling is mutual with Todd, that Todd wants to meet with Deion because Deion's a pretty cool figure, right, to a lot of people. A lot of people want to meet Deion. Not crazy to think of. Here's the thing. When we talk about Deion Sanders is two things at the same time. But because he's those two things, people talk about him as if he is something that he is not. And I mean this in no way to be disrespectful to Deion, But like people kind of talk about Deion as if he is like this marionette behind the scenes, like he's pulling all the strings. That's not really the case. What Deion is the father of Shedeur Sanders and the head coach of Shedeur Sanders while he was in college. And that role that Deion has played, that dual role that Deion has played, is, if you filter out his comments through that lens, it makes a lot of what you hear very uncontroversial. Is it crazy to say, like last year, Dan Lanning talked to Kevin Stefanski a lot about Dillon Gabriel because Dan Lanning was a big fan of Dillon Gabriel. That's pretty normal, right? Nobody wrote any articles about Dan Lanning trying to manipulate the Browns quarterback situation. It was simply Kevin Stefanski reaching out and having a conversation with a colleague who also happens to be the head coach of a guy that you drafted. I mean, that's pretty normal, right? Like if a rookie or a second-year player, if you're in contact with, hell, people still talk to Dabo Swinney about Deshaun Watson, right? That's not even weird. Then remember when Deshaun was getting ready to get drafted the first few years of his career, Dabo was always available for a soundbite to say something about Deshaun Watson. So the idea of a college coach encouraging or wanting to have a conversation, especially when it comes to the quarterback position, to the current head coach of a team, well, that's not crazy. That's not crazy at all. And then what's even less crazy is the idea of a father wanting an introduction with the head coach of his son's football team, especially when that father is a peer to that head coach, right? Both head coaches in college, both career lifers in football. Would make sense. None of this sounds crazy to me. I don't know how this became a big story. Well, I do know how this became a big story because it has nothing to do with the actual context and the actual juice of the story. It has everything to do with people seeing this as an opportunity to get their shit off, right? Whether you are one of those people who will ride the Sanders into the sun or you're one of those people who just hate the Sanders family. This is your chance to get your shit off, right? Whenever something with Deion comes up, it's people's chance to get whatever shit off they feel like is appropriate for Deion Sanders. But what's important to remember in all this controversy is it doesn't matter what Deion Sanders thinks about Todd Monken. It doesn't matter what Deion Sanders thinks about the Browns quarterback room. It doesn't matter if Deion thinks that the Browns should be starting his son, which of course he thinks, by the way. Of course he thinks the Browns should start his son. Yeah, like it's his son and it's the guy that he had play quarterback for him for 4 years. That is somebody that Deion Sanders obviously believes in, right? It's not a surprise. It would be more shocking if he did not believe in it. As obvious as that is, it's also just as obvious that it doesn't matter what Deion thinks in this situation. It's going to have no impact over who gets to become the quarterback for the Cleveland Browns. Like, that's just the reality of it. Deion Sanders does not have as much power outside of the University of Colorado that people seem to wish that Deion has or seem to kind of throw at Deion in a more nefarious way, right? Like, there's two angles of this. There are people who love Deion and want to live vicariously through Deion, so they want to imagine that Deion is such a powerful figure that he can make the NFL bend to his will, right? There certainly is that aspect to some of the fandom of Deion Sanders. But on the other end of it, there are people who will talk about Deion Sanders as if he's like the evil emperor in Star Wars in robes and a hoodie, like controlling everything behind the scenes. And the reality is Deion Sanders is a NFL legend who is now a head coach for a college football team. And that's about as far as his power goes. Outside of Colorado, he really does not have that much power. We've been through this before. I remember going through this when we were in the pre-draft process for Shedeur Sanders, and everybody was trying to convince me that even if the Browns wanted to take Shedeur, which I did not think that they wanted to take Shedeur at number 2 overall in 2025, and I ended up being correct on that, that somehow the Sanders family was going to block the Browns from drafting Shedeur that early. Obviously, that was not true. Obviously, the Sanders family did not have the kind of pool where they can manipulate the landing spot of Shedeur Sanders. That is obviously true. Okay, maybe you can make the argument that the opposite happened, and I think some people do make that argument, but even then, that's not what people were saying before the draft. People were acting like he could control and dictate where Shedeur goes, like he was a Manning family member. The whole Eli Manning thing gets overrated, right, about the Manning family's influence, and that at the end of the day, the Chargers wanted Phillip Rivers anyways, right? Like that's what allowed that to happen. They wanted Phillip Rivers. They weren't really that dead set on getting Eli Manning. They were okay with the swap, so it happened. The only time a player's ever really successfully had enough leverage to force their way out of the draft position that they were in was John Elway. And that was only because John Elway didn't have just the backing of a powerful family behind him, but had the backing of the institution of Major League Baseball at the time, the biggest franchise in Major League Baseball at the time in the New York Yankees, and the biggest figure in Major League Baseball at the time in George Steinbrenner and the New York Yankees owner at the time. And you have to remember, in 1980, baseball was number 1 in America, not football. That had not happened yet, right? Football takes over during the 90s, especially after the steroid era of baseball. But in the 80s, baseball was king. So the number 1 franchise of the number 1 organization of the number 1 sport in the country, this is still America pastime era of baseball, holding that leverage is a lot different than anything that could happen to the NFL nowadays, where the NFL is just too big for anything like that to happen. Even today, if the Yankees were threatening to draft a number 1 overall pick prospect, it's still unlikely to work because baseball is just not as big as the NFL anymore. It's much smaller now. So the power fantasy that like Deion was going to be able to control that was always ridiculous. And this is my point. I feel like people freak out about these Deion Sanders quotes, not because anything that he is saying is crazy, but because they have crazy ideas of what Deion is trying to do behind the scenes. When at the end of the day, Deion speaking as a former head coach of the player that's in question is Shedeur Sanders, and he's speaking as the father of Shedeur Sanders. And when you think of it through that lens, nothing he's saying is controversial. Like Deion will talk to Todd Monken. That will absolutely happen. And Todd Monken will be happy to talk to Deion Sanders, right? Will it matter in any bit or direction what the Browns are going to do at quarterback? No, it's not going to matter. So what are we actually talking about? We'll continue on that, but first I got to thank my sponsor, PrizePicks. PrizePicks is a fun way to earn cash while you watch your favorite teams. No complex betting rules, just pick more or less on a few player stats and lock in your lineup. Here are my picks for this upcoming season, AFC North edition. Jimmy Bernard, I have less than 475. This has to do with volume available in Pittsburgh's offense. Quincy Judkins, I have over 975. Browns improved line. I think the run game is going to be better with it. Chase Brown, under 900 yards. Joe Burrow equals less rushing yards usually for the Bengals offense. Mark Andrews, more than 475 yards. Lamar's going to need a safety blanket. Check to see if PrizePicks is available in your state. You could follow me on the app at Quinn_C to see all my lineups. Download the PrizePicks app today. Play $5 and get $50 in lineup to download the app using the link in the description. I have tried very hard to stay out of that business, right? Whenever it comes to things that aren't really Shedeur Sanders, but related to Shedeur Sanders being in the news cycle, right? A couple of weeks ago, Shiloh was in the news. Shiloh Sanders, Shedeur Sanders is he his little brother or older brother? I think he's the older brother. Shedeur Sanders' older brother was in the news because he was going back and forth with Mary Kay, right? You know, he said something on Instagram, and then he went on a podcast and doubled down on the things that he said on Instagram. I don't think Mary Kay ever responded to anything that Shiloh said, but, Shiloh was critical of Mary Kay publicly. A lot of people covered that as a Brown story, and I just don't know how that's a Brown story. That is a story for if you care about Mary Kay. That is a story for if you care about the Sanders family, but none of that has to do with anything related to the Cleveland Browns, because Shiloh is not a member of the Cleveland Browns, and Mary Kay covers the Browns, but she's not a member of the organization. So how does this affect the team? I just didn't see a reason to cover it. It's pointless. It's just gossip. It's just it's drama, basically, right? It's just pure drama. And again, it's a conduit for other conversation. How do you feel about Mary Kay? How do you feel about the tone of criticism that came from Shiloh Sanders? And it becomes something that's much bigger than the scope of football, that conversation, than actually the football that is the excuse for us to even have this conversation about either Mary Kay or Shiloh. So when this Deion story comes across my desk, it made me ask this question. I hear so much from so many people on both sides of this, by the way, right? Like there are Sanders fans who say this, and there are non-Sanders fans who say this and talk about how tired they are about the news cycle and everything getting picked up. But also, when stories like this come up, people really want to talk about it. And I think the simple answer is people just want to talk about how Deion makes them feel. Right? Whether it's positive, whether it's negative. All of this stuff comes down to it, especially when it's a quote from Deion Sanders. Because nobody looked at that quote and asked themselves, is this just the perspective of a father? Is this just the perspective of a guy who coached a quarterback for 4 years? Because if you looked at it through that lens, nothing he said was remarkable. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. It's just he said what you would expect a guy in that situation to say. None of this is controversial. None of this is worth getting angry about. And most importantly, none of this is going to have a single effect on the Browns season. Positive or negative, it's not happening. The Browns' decision at quarterback is not going to be influenced by whatever podcast that Deion Sanders gets on and whatever quotes he gives on those podcasts. Todd Monken is not sitting there searching Deion Sanders on Twitter and getting every quote and putting that on the board of why he will or will not start Shedeur Sanders. If you want a cheat sheet for this year's quarterback competition, I'll give you a cheat sheet. I'll spoil the quarterback competition for you. The quicker they announce a starter, the more likely it's going to be Deshaun Watson. The reason has nothing to do with how I feel about Deshaun. I don't think the Browns should really be entertaining Deshaun. I'd much rather see Shedeur start this year. But the reality is that they've talked about a clean slate, right? And if they're not factoring in Deshaun Watson's tape from 2024, and they're not factoring in Shedeur Sanders' tape from 2025, but they're also trying to make a decision before July, before training camp starts, everything about that favors Deshaun Watson, right? Like that's why there's so much noise about Deshaun Watson starting, because that's what people know. Todd has said he's thrown out the tape on both of these players. They're going to give them a clean slate, and they're trying to make a decision before July. And if they do make a decision on the starting quarterback before they get to training camp, then that's probably going to be Deshaun Watson. And it's probably going to be Deshaun Watson for things that are outside the control of Shedeur Sanders, which is Deshaun Watson is a 10-year vet. And yeah, the last 5 years, he has not been great on the field, but he is still a 10-year vet. So if you're judging the quarterback competition in shorts and T-shirts and meeting rooms, Deshaun's probably going to come off much better than the second-year player in Shedeur Sanders. Deshaun's probably going to be much sharper in that meeting room than Shedeur. Not because he's inherently smarter than Shedeur or more capable overall. I don't know if that's true, but because Deshaun has been in the league for 10 years and he's just seen more stuff. Right? The Deshaun's problem hasn't been when he has shorts and a t-shirt on. Deshaun's problem hasn't been in the meeting room. Deshaun's problem has been actually playing football. So if they make this decision before Deshaun actually has to play football, they're probably going to start Deshaun Watson. Here's another cheat code for you guys, or cheat sheet. The longer this competition goes, the more favorable it is for Shedeur Sanders. Because again, Deshaun Watson's problem is actually playing football. And if you get to the point to where Deshaun has to actually play football, it is my personal belief that Shedeur could very easily outplay Deshaun Watson. Last cheat code for you guys for this quarterback competition, since everybody's so worried about it. You're probably going to see both of these guys throughout the season. We're probably going to see a healthy chunk of Deshaun, and we're probably going to see a healthy chunk of Shedeur. Much like last year when I said, hey, all four of these quarterbacks are going to play. We might even get a fifth quarterback to play. Everybody was like, no, they're going to force Dylan down our throats, all this stuff. And it's like, eventually Shedeur played. Eventually Bailey Zapp played, right? Like, you're going to see both these guys this year. They'll be able to play football this year. Barring injury, you're going to see both of them. But back to this whole Deion thing. From day one of Shedeur's prospects evolving as a quarterback, the media has had the habit of making too much of how much an impact Deion can have over his son's career. I have argued this since the beginning. Remember what I said at the beginning of this video, right? Where people were were convinced that Deion was going to have the kind of pull that the Manning family had to be able to force his son to the right location as far as teams go. That teams were having to basically, recruit Shedeur to their team so that Deion gave them the okay. That's how people were really talking about this thing, right? Oh, Shedeur's wearing the Giants cleats. He wants to go to the Giants, as if he wasn't in a draft where he wants to go is irrelevant. But people convinced themselves that where he wanted to go was relevant because they were convinced that like Deion was going to have some kind of power, extraordinary power to force Shedeur somewhere. But that ended up being unbelievably wrong. Again, we talked about that at the beginning of this video. He did not have the power to dictate where his son went. Even when it comes to the draft slide, which a lot of people do blame on Deion, I don't know how fair that is to blame Deion for that draft slide. Because I think the reality is that Shedeur came off bad in meetings. And when you're a quarterback, you can't come off bad in meetings, right? And NFL teams also just weren't as high on Shedeur as maybe Mel Kiper was, right? And that disconnect led to the perception of him being one thing, but the reality being another thing. And then obviously, I think another factor in this is the fandom, is the fame that Shedeur carries. And NFL teams are notoriously hesitant to have famous backup quarterbacks. So once they did not deem him, evaluate him as a starting quarterback, and Shedeur kind of fell into this pile of quarterbacks in the draft that are projects or backups to start, which a lot of the NFL clearly deemed him as, because nobody took him where you would take a starting quarterback. It became baggage that he's famous because head coaches normally don't want famous backup quarterbacks, no matter who you are, no matter how accomplished you are. Those are the major factors in why Shedeur fell. There's a ton of conspiracies surrounding it. Some people blame Deion. Some people think it was a conspiracy by the NFL. But I see what happened to Shedeur happen to other players all the time, right? Like Garrett Nussmeier, for different reasons than Shedeur, obviously. It was because he had some kind of cyst on his spine or something like that. He went from being a projected late first to second round pick to a 7th round pick. And that wasn't even a story this year. Nobody really even cared about that past like the day after the draft. We tend to overvalue or overestimate the power that Deion's words have because we don't look at Deion as a person sometimes. We look at him as an entity, but we really should stop doing that. And that kind of is my point. I feel like we will be at a much healthier place when we stop reacting to Deion like he is some kind of puppet master behind the scenes and just start listening to him as what he actually is. The former head coach of Shedeur Sanders and the father of Shedeur Sanders. Because if you look at stuff through that lens, absolutely nothing he said about Shedeur has not been said before by somebody in his position and won't be said again by somebody in his position. When that is the case, and it wasn't a big deal when it was Dabo talking about Deshaun Watson, when it's not going to be a big deal when it's Steve Sarkisian talking about Arch Manning, right? Maybe we should probably not make it as big of a deal when Shedeur's father and former head coach does the same. Maybe we should chill out a little bit. That's my 2 cents on it. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.